Most of the information on the life of Sacher-Masoch comes to us from his secretary, Schlichtigrol, Sacher-Masoch und der Masochismus, and from his first wife, who took the name of the heroine of Venus in Furs, Wanda von Sacher-Masoch, Confessions of My Life. Wanda's book is excellent, but it was severely judged by subsequent biographers, who often merely present us with subjective impressions of the work. In their opinion, the image she offers of herself is too innocent, and they assumed her to be a sadist, since Masoch was a masochist. But this may well be a misstatement of the problem. Leopold von Sacher-Masoch was born in 1835 in Lemberg, Galicia. He was of Slav, Spanish and Bohemian descent. His ancestors held official positions in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was chief of police of Lemberg, and as a child he witnessed prison scenes and riots which were to have a profound effect on him. His work is deeply influenced by the problems of nationalities, minority groups, and revolutionary movements in the empire, hence his Galician, Jewish, Hungarian, Prussian tales, etc. He often describes the organization of agricultural communes and the struggle of the peasants against the Austrian administration and especially against the landowners. He became involved in the Pan-Slavic movement. The men he admired, besides Goethe, were Pushkin and Lermontov, and he was known himself as the Turgenev of Little Russia. He was appointed professor of history at Grez and began his literary career by writing historical novels. He met with rapid success. One of his first genre novels, The Divorced Woman, 1870, aroused interest even in America. In France, Hachette, Commonlevy, and Flammarion published translations of his novels and stories. One of his translators was able to present him as a strict moralist who drew his inspiration from history and folklore, without making the slightest allusion to the erotic character of his works. His fantasies were probably made more acceptable by the fact that they could be attributed to the spirit of the Slav people. We must also take into account the more general explanation that the standards of censorship and tolerance of the 19th century were very different from our own, diffuse sexuality being more acceptable than specific physical and mental details. In the language of Masochist folklore, history, politics, mysticism, eroticism, nationalism, and perversion are closely intermingled, forming a nebula around the scenes of flagellation. He was consequently disturbed when Krafft-Ebing used his name to designate a perversion. Masoch was a famous and honored writer. In 1886 he made a triumphant journey to Paris where he was decorated and entertained by the Figaro and the Revue du Monde. Masoch's tastes in matters of love are well known. He enjoyed pretending to be a bear or a bandit or having himself pursued, tied up and subjected to punishments, humiliations, and even acute physical pain by an opulent fur-clad woman with a whip. He was given to dressing up as a servant, making use of all kinds of fetishes and disguises, placing advertisements in newspapers, signing contracts with the women in his life and if need be prostituting them. An affair with Anna von Kottowitz inspired The Divorced Woman, another affair, with Fanny von Pister, Venus in Furs. Then a young lady by the name of Aurora Reimelin approached him by means of a somewhat ambiguous correspondence, took the pseudonym of Wanda, and married Masoch in 1873. As a companion she was at once docile, demanding, and overwhelmed. Masoch was fated to be disappointed as though the masquerades he planned were bound to give rise to misunderstandings. He was always attempting to introduce a third party into his menage, the character he calls the Greek. During this period with Anna von Kottowitz, a sham Polish count entered their life, revealing himself later to be a chemist assistant wanted for theft and dangerously ill. Then there is the strange adventure involving Aurora/Wanda, the hero of which appears to be Ludwig II of Bavaria. The story is included among the appendices to this book. Here again the ambivalence of the characters, the disguises, the pairing of the parties involved turn the whole episode into an extraordinary ballet ending in disappointment. Finally there is the adventure with Armand of the Figaro, of which Wanda gives an excellent account, leaving the reader to make his own amendments. This episode was the reason for Masoch's journey to Paris in 1886, and it also marks the end of his union with Wanda. In 1887 he married his children's governess. In a novel by Miriam Harry, Sonia in Berlin, we find an interesting portrait of Masoch in retirement. He died in 1895, saddened by the neglect into which his work had fallen. And yet his writings are important and unusual. He conceived of them as a cycle or rather as a series of cycles. The principal one is entitled The Heritage of Cain and was to have treated 6 themes: love, property, money, the state, war, and death. Only the first 2 parts were finished, but the other 4 themes can already be discerned in them. The folk tales and the ethnic tales form secondary cycles. They include in particular 2 somber novels dealing with mystical sects in Galicia which rank among the best of Masoch's works and reach heights of anguish and tension rarely equaled elsewhere, The Fisher of Souls and The Mother of God. What is the meaning of the term Heritage of Cain? It is intended first to express the burden of crime and suffering inherited by humanity. However, this apparent cruelty conceals the more secret theme of the coldness of nature, of the steppe, of the icy image of the mother wherein Cain discovers his own destiny. The coldness of the stern mother is in reality a transmutation of cruelty from which the new man emerges. The mark of Cain indicates how the heritage is to be used. Cain and Christ bear the same mark, which leads to the crucifixion of man who knows no sexual love, no property, no fatherland, no cause, no work, who dies of his own willing, embodying the idea of humanity. The work of Masoch draws on all the forces of German Romanticism. In our opinion, no other writer has used to such effect the resources of fantasy and suspense. He has a particular way of desexualizing love and at the same time sexualizing the entire history of humanity. Venus in Furs, Venus im Pelz, 1870, is one of Masoch's most famous novels. It forms part of the first volume of The Heritage of Cain, which deals with the subject of love. A translation by the economist Arlados de Beaufort appeared simultaneously in French and in English in 1902, but it was extremely inaccurate. The present version is a translation from the French of a subsequent translation by Haute Will. The novel is followed by 3 appendices. The first is a general statement by Masoch on the novel, followed by an account of a scene from his childhood. The second consists of the love contracts that Masoch signed with Fanny von Pister and Wanda. The third appendix is Wanda Sacher-Masoch's account of the adventure with Ludwig II. Masoch has been treated unjustly, not because his name was unfairly given to the perversion of Masochism, but quite the reverse, because his work fell into neglect whereas his name passed into current usage. Although we occasionally find books written on Sada that show no knowledge of his work, this is increasingly rare. Sada is becoming more thoroughly known. Clinical studies of sadism are considerably enriched by literary studies of the work of Sada, and vice versa. Even the best writings on Masoch, however, show a surprising ignorance of his work. Sada and Masoch are not merely cases among others, they both have something essential to teach us, the one about masochism and the other about sadism. The second reason why Masoch's fate is unjust is that in clinical terms he is considered complementary to Sada. This may indeed be the reason why people who are interested in Sada show no particular interest in Masoch. It is too readily assumed that the symptoms only have to be transposed and the instincts reversed for maso to be turned into sada, according to the principle of the unity of opposites. The theme of the unity of sadism and masochism and the concept of a sadomasochistic entity have done great harm to maso. He has suffered not only from unjust neglect but also from an unfair assumption of complementarity and dialectical unity with sada. As soon as we read maso, we become aware that his universe has nothing to do with that of sada. Their techniques differ, and their problems, their concerns, and their intentions are entirely dissimilar. It is not valid to object that psychoanalysis has long shown the possibility and the reality of transformations between sadism and masochism. We are questioning the very concept of an entity known as sadomasochism. Medicine distinguishes between syndromes and symptoms, a symptom being the specific sign of an illness, and a syndrome the meeting place or crossing point of manifestations issuing from very different origins and arising within variable contexts. We would like to suggest that sadomasochism is a syndrome that ought to be split up into irreducible causal chains. It has been stated so often that sadism and masochism are found in the same person that we have come to believe it. We need to go back to the beginning and read sada and maso. Because the judgment of the clinician is prejudiced, we must take an entirely different approach, the literary approach, since it is from literature that stem the original definitions of sadism and masochism. It is no accident that the names of two writers were used as labels for these two perversions. The critical, in the literary sense, and the clinical, in the medical sense, may be destined to enter into a new relationship of mutual learning. Symptomatology is always a question of art, the clinical. Specificities of sadism and masochism are not separable from the literary. Values peculiar to sada and maso. In place of a dialectic which all too readily perceives the link between opposites, we should aim for a critical and clinical appraisal able to reveal the truly differential mechanisms as well as the artistic originalities.